Let's see what Corey has to say about overblown controversy of Clone Wars lore. This is gonna be interesting, I guess. We shall see. And I did this again. I could be up here.
In 2008, the Star Wars prequels were followed up with a fourth movie set between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, mostly explaining why Obi-Wan famously said,
"I was once a
cartoon character
same as your father."
in the original Star Wars, and introducing the as-yet unknown fact that Anakin had his own Padawan, Ahsoka. This was then followed up by the Clone Wars animated series, originally running until its 6th season in 2014, although Season 6 was technically a post-cancellation release of a few different arcs which were already in production, and then more recently there was the 7th season as well. For some Star Wars fans, this Clone Wars show is a foundational part of building their Star Wars fandom, or even acted as their entry point into Star Wars. But it's also the subject of some controversy, and has been since it was released, particularly with fans of some of the prior media which made up the Clone Wars multimedia project. Today we're going to talk about some of the reasons why this controversy exists or existed, what its implications are, and where I think some of it gets taken way too far. The Clone Wars Multimedia Project, or
Let's see what he says then.
an MP, for those unfamiliar, refers to a collection of Clone Wars stories told primarily across the Star Wars Republic comics, a set of books which include Shatterpoint, The Cestus Deception, MedStar 1 and 2, Jedi Trial, and Yoda Dark Rendezvous, and then probably most notably the original 2003 animated show by Genndy Tartakovsky. The basic premise with this media, plus some additional young reader novels, video games, and short stories from Star Wars Insider, was to cover the 3 years of the Clone Wars over the 3 years between Episode 2 and 3. In practice, you'll sometimes see the label extended a bit to refer to most things covering the Clone Wars up until the 2008 show and its various tie-in media, so that includes stuff like the Republic Commando books, Dark Lord, the Republic Commando game, and so on.
Although the TCW time media and stuff, I would say shouldn't be lumped in with it because it was its own multimedia project type thing, because it gives the impression that that's in there.
Though they're not strictly part of what the project referred to directly. While some of the fan complaints about the 2008 Clone Wars cartoon comes down to opinions on quality, that's not something I'm really going to touch today. This isn't a review of the series or an attempt to compare the quality of the original show to 2008. Instead, where the controversy I'm talking about today came from is the classic issue of canon and continuity. Essentially, the claim is that the 2008 show should not be considered canon to the expanded universe, now called Legends, because of contradictions to the prior established canon, particularly contradictions between it and the Multimedia Project. These issues include, but are not limited to, the inclusion of Ahsoka, despite her never being mentioned in media which supposedly existed to cover the entirety of the war before, the existence of the pacifist faction ruling Mandalore, the inhibitor chips in the clones versus Order 66 simply being a part of and result of their training and conditioning, and a variety of other things, some smaller, like when characters met, and some larger, more on the scale of the ones I already mentioned, including one particular example that we'll get into later in the video. The idea that this was separate from the expanded universe was taken even further with the announcement of the sequel trilogy and the reboot of the expanded universe. Since the 2008 show was being included in the new canon, much like the movies, there were renewed arguments that it could, should, or even was excluded from the rebranded Legends continuity, followed...
Yeah, oh boy. No, we don't need to see his face yet. Let's go back a little bit. Yeah, and the Revenge of the Sith novel capped off the multimedia project because it was written alongside the multimedia project and with the early script of Revenge of the Sith and all of that, and counterparted Revenge of the Sith, including a lot of stuff from the expanded universe in it.
Expanded universe. Since the 2008 show was being included in the new canon, much like the movies, there were renewed arguments that it could, should, or even was excluded from the rebranded Legends continuity, followed by the serious allegation that the show didn't even like this video or subscribe for more. But aside from people being completely free to say they didn't like the changes it made, I think these claims ignore a lot of how the Legends continuity evolved after the 2008 Clone Wars show started, and overstate the cohesiveness of the pre-existing continuity, even just within the multimedia project. As far as the development of the 2008 show goes, concerns about continuity did come up pretty quickly among some fans. It is definitely true that consistency with pre-existing material was not a significant concern for George Lucas, who was very much involved in the initial production of the show, including being the originator of the idea that Anakin had a Padawan, even if a lot of the actual work into creating Ahsoka and a lot of the show running was done more directly by Dave Filoni. And
Where's that information from? Is it in the featurettes? I would have noted it in here. They didn't mention it in the featurettes. I don't know if I've watched the featurette for the movie. I think I have. I'd have to see a source on that originally. Obviously the TV show would have been like, okay, we want a TV show in the Clone Wars period. That could have been George's initial idea. And then a lot of the details came later and with other people and all that. How much of it would have originally been George's idea is up to interpretation based on secondhand information, probably. And yeah, I don't tend to take post-2014 sources because they want things viewed a certain way and try to frame it that way.
And had a Padawan, even if a lot of the actual work into creating Ahsoka and a lot of the show running was done more directly by Dave Filoni. And especially...
Yeah, I haven't seen any thing saying that George really had the idea of it being a Padawan, or if it was sort of a collective idea type thing.
In the eyes of the fans, Filoni became the main name and face attached to the show.
Mm-hmm.
Filoni addressed a question in 2008 about continuity with the expanded universe, saying this.
But much like the actual theatrical features, we can't let that get in the way of telling the story George wants to, or telling a story that just kind of makes sense for the period of time we're involved with. I take a lot of that information that I'm aware of and I bring it in front of George when we're first pitching out an idea, or when he has an idea and I say, well, this was on Wikipedia and this is in this dictionary, so we better look at this. And, you know, he considers it or not. You know, sometimes he hasn't seen that material at all and he's kind of surprised. And sometimes it's just not something that interests him because, you know, it wasn't really something that he had invented and he wants to go a different direction.
So ultimately, much like he did with the prequels, George was going to do what George wanted to do, while others around him, like Dave, had a bit more experience with the expanded universe and tried to get in a few things, or at least gave George in the show the option of following it and pulling from it or not. But the overriding concern, as it so often is, was telling the story they wanted to tell, and this certainly applies to Filoni and the other writers as well.
I think this also goes into the argument, right? If we're saying that the TCW should not be part of the expanded universe, originally they never intended for it to be. Is where that quote would lead that train of thought to go. Right? Is that from the start they knew that it would contradict, and that's actually a great quote he pulls up there because you can see him saying it's recorded and all that. And basically they went, okay, we're gonna pretty much disregard this if we want to do something else.
Give the impression that this was just George fighting back against a room full of people who were trying to maintain the sanctity of continuity or something. You can decide for yourself how serious or ridiculous you think that phrase is, but they all did follow George's lead on that. The pre-existing lore from the expanded universe and the MMP wasn't something they were or felt beholden to. It was instead an area they could pull from if they felt like it. So characters like Ventress, who played a huge role in prior media, could be brought in, But a lot could and would be changed about both their backgrounds and the events in which they participated in the war. Originally, Ventress was supposed to have been from Rat Attack, but in the Clone Wars she gets established as having been taken from the Night Sisters. The fact that the show did make these kinds of changes to the lore even became controversial among some of the Star Wars authors, particularly for Karen Traviss, author of the Republic Commando books, who...
Because in the Republic Commando books, there was huge on Mandalorian lore that Karen Traviss built up.
was upset about some of what was done with the clones and the Mandalorians in particular, and then who left Star Wars writing as a result of these changes. Henry Gilroy, who wrote for the 2008 movie and show, said, quote, "It's unfortunate that she is moving on because of her opinion that canon is being changed. I guess the big problem is the assumption that her work is canon in the first place. After working with George on the Clone Wars series, I know there are elements of her work that are not in line with his vision of Star Wars, and in my mind, only George Lucas's Star Wars is canon. Everything else is expanded universe. In my opinion, George's work on Star Wars, whether he created it before or after the other writers, trumps all because he created Star Wars in the first place."
And that's the mindset you get of one of the main writers on the show, right? How do I say this? My brain has to work now, yay. Why was she led to the assumption that her work was canonical, right? It's because it was Star Wars and Infinities before. There wasn't Star Wars and Expanded Universe and Infinities. There was Star Wars and everything that came out, and yes, some stuff is more loosely connected and not quite as... the details are correct, but the main thrust of it is, especially later on when the Republic Commando series was written. And it was a growing piece of work that did care enough to include information from everything else as best it could. And he might mention something about that later. And I guess this comes from the point of view of people saying, oh, everything George Lucas said was canon is canon, versus it being what Lucasfilm developed in the Expanded Universe as part of the Expanded Universe, and is canonical to the Expanded Universe as well. Because it's overblown controversy. It's also tricky because a lot of the Expanded Universe got input from George. Oh, hey! Wait, is your name on there? Oh, I do see you on there! Oh, I only did one lesson earlier because couldn't be bothered doing more. Yeah, I did more. There we go. Maybe we'll do a friend quest finally, who knows? Yeah. I think it's interesting because he shows that she thought that her works were at least counting towards the Expanded Universe canon and it was important. And then she's told it's not. And as a writer, I'd feel very offended by that too. You gotta work harder at it, Lock On. Get good. Yeah, I'd be offended too. And maybe parts of what she did was an overreaction. But I would also probably go, well, why would I want to write for something that obviously goes, well, we're not going to value any of the ideas that you're putting into it and we're just going to throw them aside if we feel like it.
So technically you may be saying the creators didn't consider the show part of the Expanded Universe either. But it's not quite in the same way that the argument it should be excluded from Legends holds. Instead, it's more akin to the way that the movies aren't considered part of the expanded universe in and of themselves, but they still very much make up the canon that the expanded universe is based on. So
That's a tricky thing with TCWs because it came so late that the expanded universe couldn't accommodate properly to be able to affect the changes of the Clone Wars because there were so many things that would have needed to be retconned that never got retconned. And it's connecting to chat. Why is it doing that? Weird. I'll reload the tab. I'm still streaming, I guess. That's the odd thing with that. Is that the movies came first before anything else. George clearly banned stuff set in the prequel era for authors writing because it's like if he does movies he's going to do them in that era and all of that. I think Firefox is having a hissy fit. I'll go to here and fix that. And so we see later on that if you're introducing stuff and it has to try and accommodate so differently to it, that it would cause problems because it was living and growing and it tried to adjust as it went and incorporated ideas even from TCW and that in there, that it would be an issue, something that, okay, yeah, it's coming up with the chat properly now. Things have to reload, yeah.
that her work.
Okay, we're back at it. What was it said? What was the your brain at the moment? Okay.
Is canon in the first place. After working with George on the Clone Wars series, and George's work on Star Wars, whether he created it before or after the other writers, trumps all because he created Star Wars in the first place. So technically you may be saying the creators didn't consider the show part of the expanded universe either. But it's not quite in the same way that the argument it should be excluded from Legends holds. Instead, it's more akin to the way that the movies aren't considered part of the expanded universe in and of themselves, but they still very much make up the canon that the expanded universe is based on.
Yeah, that's the point I was making. The movies came earlier, before everything expanding universe was written, for information that could be included in the expanded universe from the movies. So when you have something come out so much later and introduce new ideas with it and contradict what is in the expanded universe, fans are going to have questions and you're going to have to answer them in some way or another, which they didn't really do.
So they are included in the
With
canon of the
most
expanded
things.
universe, even if as individual pieces of media, they are not labeled expanded universe. And the difference between the handling of this for the prequels and for the cartoon is not a difference in type, it's simply a difference in degree. This kind of thing is why in 2000 the Holocron Continuity Database was created by Leland Chi, labeling multiple different tiers of canon hierarchy, placing George's work at the top in G canon, followed by C or Continuity canon, which was most of the recent material, particularly since Heir to the Empire, followed by S or Secondary canon, which tended to include things from the old Marvel comics, for example, that had a lot of differences from what was going on at the time. Then there was D or Detours canon from Star Wars Detours, and finally things like the Infinity Stories under an entirely non-canon label. When the 2008 Clone Wars was created, and other shows like Star
And I feel like a lot of people misinterpret the canon tiers, so just quickly, they were labels within the Holocron database of where they were from, more than how much they count towards continuity, because everything was taken as a case-by-case basis, as shown by quotes from Leland Chi, also on the forums, like he had pulled up there when he started saying about it.
tended to include things from the old Marvel entirely non-canon label. When the 2000
And you might as well not mention Detours canon, because there's nothing that we can actually see that was officially released in Detours canon.
things
Detours was never released. Oh, come on. There's a few bits online that leaked because it never came out. But there's no reason to actually mention D-Canon a lot of the time because D2 was never released. But also this will be a way of seeing the public awareness of something. So a lot of the time, people will be more aware of George Lucas's stuff. Then they'll be aware of the TV shows, which is going to include TCW. But not... See, he didn't mention the introduction of T-Canon yet, hang on.
Wars was created.
But, yeah.
And other shows like Star Wars Underworld were being planned by George. They were placed between the C and G canon levels as T or television canon.
See, the weird thing about this, though, is you had a television canon that didn't include the Clone Wars micro-series by Genndy Tartakovsky, which theoretically should be in there. But I reckon they went, oh, that conflicts, we're not going to include it in there.
Notably, this database doesn't categorize things by individual work. It primarily lists things by piece of lore. I think one particularly...
That is it, yeah. People will... It's a marker of how aware people will be of the piece of lore. So the movies would be on top. Then you have stuff in TV shows. Then you have stuff in novels, comics, video games, all the stuff in C canon. And then only hardcore fans would start going even deeper into the old Marvel comics and that sort of thing.
Helpful thing that people do, which has gotten...
I mean, hardcore fans would know every single bit from novels and comics and that, but you know what I mean. If people pick and choose a bit, they pick some comics, they pick some novels. It's likely some people would know about that stuff more than the old stuff.
Possibly even more common recently is that they'll see one contradiction between a newer work and an older work, and they'll jump straight to getting angry that the whole thing is no longer canon or no longer counts. It's again very difficult to find any two works which are entirely 100% in sync with each other, so you kind of always have to go in with an understanding that beyond the scope of the story...
Bro. It's not difficult. I'm reading the Jedi Academy trilogy right now. And that really neatly ties up how the Thrawn trilogy, Dark Empire, and the Jedi Academy trilogy all work together and are meshed together really well. It was very good. It's very connective trilogy, but then also brings a new story of really building his Jedi Order. And you don't have to look far past the Thrawn trilogy, which more people know about than other EU stuff a lot of the time when they're talking about novels, to go, that is actually working really well together.
You're reading at the moment, sometimes things don't all work out together. When the prequels came out, a lot of prior assumptions about what the period looked like went out the window, and a lot of competing visions from both books and comics turned out to be wrong, some of which played significant roles in foundational parts of the expanded universe, like the Thrawn trilogy.
This is because he went off of George's notes at the time and George changed his mind. Don't forget to mention.
I've done a video on this in the past, which I'll link to, so we won't go into too many details here, but the fact that the prequels did so heavily contradict parts of the Thrawn trilogy doesn't mean that the Thrawn trilogy shouldn't have been considered canon to the expanded universe anymore, or that, conversely, the prequels should have been jettisoned when the reboot happened either. Much like we'll see with the 2008 cartoon, as the expanded universe went on beyond the prequels publishing, the prequels continued to get more and more built into the stories that were coming out in later novels, and while some things did get satisfactorily retconned, other things just kind of stick out as not being compatible, and it's just kind of a what are you going to do situation. But well, George...
And Leland Chi promised he was going to do retcons for the TCW stuff, but then because of the cancellation of TCW, he never finished that. Especially the later stuff.
May not have been under any obligation to care about what expanded universe authors or creators did, even if he did sometimes decide to pull elements like the name Coruscant and then Ayla Secura in, but the expanded universe authors and creators were pretty beholden to what George decided, and this applied to the Clone Wars 2008 show as well as to the movies. So this is where you really run into issues with saying you can just lift the 2008 Clone Wars out and then nothing else would change in the expanded universe. Or where, in my opinion, you're being unreasonable if you claim that a quote-unquote true expanded universe fan would never include the 2008 Clone Wars cartoon in the Legends continuity, as I've seen on at least a few occasions since we announced that the Fall of the Republic mod I work on for Empire at War would include content from the cartoon.
Deleted
this
user.
is something we have heard repeatedly. When the 2008 show came out, we were still 6 years from the reset, so Leland Chee and others at Lucasfilm got to work trying to make the retcons they could to make things fit together as much as possible. Generally, the strategy...
In the end, there got to be so many that he was gonna... Leland Chee and they would have to wait until the end of it and then try and come up with explanations.
Here was saying the multimedia project stuff was in a much more compressed time frame at the start of the war rather than covering the whole war, and this works better for some stuff than for others. We'll talk about the 2003 show in a bit, but the vast majority of that is actually set in the first 4 months of the war, so that doesn't become a huge problem. The final 4 chapters of that show, chapters 22 through 25, are set in the kind of final moments of the war, but we'll get back to that in a little bit.
See, there's so much in the multimedia project that compressing it into a really short time frame when it had a previous timeline to it that was more spread out doesn't really feel like it makes sense, especially with Anakin's knighting, with Jedi trial and stuff.
For the books, this gets a bit trickier, but even if you discount all of that, which you are again perfectly free to do, there were still years of Star Wars content released within the Legends continuity in which directly reference events, characters, technology, locations, and whatever else from the show. This includes reference books making heavy use of both elements of the 2008 show and the 2003 show or other MMP elements, like the Essential Guides, especially the Essential Guide to Warfare and the official Star Wars fact file, or elements from the Clone Wars showing up in book plots. Probably most notable here comes with the tie-ins between...
So, technology and the Essential Guides and source books, they're a bit whatever to me as far as they can include information from whatnot, and Essential Guide to Warfare is a bit different because that's one that tries to mesh together the continuity to work somewhat, but a lot of source books are just here's information from Star Wars stuff that's been released, more than it's trying to tell the story and trying to retcon it as such.
Fact file, or elements from the Clone Wars showing up in book plots. Probably most notable here comes with the tie-ins between Abeloth, the villain in the Fate of the Jedi series, with the Mortis trio from the Clone Wars cartoon.
I'm so interested when I actually finally read Fate of the Jedi, because I'll get there eventually. If it feels like the Mortis arc in the Clone Wars has to exist for Abeloth to exist.
The Mortis trio, and the dagger get tied in fairly heavily there. So if you're saying the Clone Wars cartoon isn't part of Legends, you then have to decide if that also includes everything which references the Clone Wars as well, or if you're allowing that to remain part of Legends. So is there Legends 1, which is everything up to 2008, Legends 2, which has everything up to 2008 plus the stuff from 2008 to 2014, and what's the bar for contradictions to cut other things out as well? And
this is the hard part of trying to remove TCW, right? Is because there's no good explanation for it to be removed and where you draw the line, or to include it. And that's the thing that gets me, is like there's no good explanation either way for it. I was just gonna try and look it up, and now my train of thought's wrecked because I was just saying that.
Thing up to 2008, Legends 2, which has everything up to 2008 plus the stuff from 2000.
Oh yeah, it was part of my collection. Where was it? Because he hasn't mentioned them yet. Hopefully he does. But these are the ones that you really have to take into consideration, and not just the inclusions in the other EU novels, which you also have to decide on. But also, Karen Travis wrote the Clone Wars movie novelization and included expanded universe information in that. But all of these, if you're removing TCW, you have to remove these books, which are not part of the new canon, they would be part of the expanded universe, but then also it's like, okay, well, what are we actually going to do about it? Because these books really can't be in a limbo state where they're not in either continuity. And you have some good connected pieces like in No Prisoners and things. Because No Prisoners was the one with the Artesian Jedi, and you see Callista Ming earlier in the timeline than later on when they're introduced and referenced back to the Clone Wars. And some are adaptations of episodes 2, but they would not be exactly the same as shown on screen. Therefore, they're a bit different and add new information, but the big ones are the Secret Missions books, these other more adult novelizations, and there's a junior novel of the movie. But then Clone Wars Gambit and Stealth and Siege is a two-parter as well. That sort of stuff you have to take into consideration as well when you're deciding, okay, how much am I going to include and how much not. And especially, and he probably will mention Darth Plagueis being a lot of people's favourite novel, that includes TCW information.
2008 to 2014, and what's the bar for contradictions to cut other things out as well? And all of this, I think, gets to the fundamental reason claiming it can't possibly be part of Legends is just kind of pointless. There almost feels like there's this idea that there was some pre-existing consistent continuity that the Clone Wars uniquely came along and ruined, even just in the period.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not suggesting the show was consistent with everything before it, far from it, but it's also far from the first thing to cause significant issues with the material that came before it. I don't even think it gets to the point of being the biggest set of contradictions. The Marvel comics, for example, are fundamentally incompatible with the timeline they present for the galaxy with the prequels and then the 90s expanded universe books, as are many of the ideas about the Clone Wars or the early Empire from before the prequels, which I talked about in that prior video. But several elements did get worked into future projects as well. Fenshisa's whole backstory being a mess didn't stop him from...
There's stuff in the Marvel comics that works really well as well. Stuff is directly connected, like they're talking about Fenshisa. And Shira Bree and Lumia. Yeah, this is a funny cover of one of the books, I think. But then they introduced so many things in the original Marvel comics that continued on as well, like the Zeltron species and stuff like that. He picked one of the interesting ones. So this cover, I don't even remember who this character is, because in the art style that it was in the comic, it looks quite different as well. Like, this is one of the covers.
Are many of the ideas about the Clone Wars or the early Empire from before the prequels, which I talked about in that prior video. But several elements did get work into future projects.
Oh no! Oh no, I can't unsee that now.
Fenshisa's whole backstory being a mess didn't stop him from making his way into later references. You can still take the Marvel comics as being technically part of Legends, while understanding that there are a lot of weird continuity bits to that. There's a reason most of my regular lore videos have at least one caveat saying that one source says one thing about a topic, while another says something else. This is just part of understanding Star Wars lore. Where the Clone Wars does...
No. What was he... Well, I was looking at the chat too then. That Chad Chin. What was he talking about again? My train of thought was lost.
Ideas about the Clone Wars or the early Empire from before the prequels, which I talked about in that prior video. But several elements did get worked into future projects as well. Fenshisa's whole backstory being a mess didn't stop him from making his way into later references. You can still take the Marvel comics as being technically part of Legends, while understanding that there are a lot of weird continuity bits to that. There's a reason most of my regular lore videos have at least one caveat saying that one source says one thing about a topic, while another says something else. This is just part of understanding Star Wars lore. Where the Clone Wars does cause some unique problems is where it's directly covering a time period that other material was already covering on a larger scale. The prequels, for example, were contradicting things that tended to just be allusions, flashbacks, or similar references, though that didn't make them any less attempts at factual claims about galactic history. You still ended up in a situation where, for example, the ages of Corran Horn's family are next to impossible to reconcile. But really, a lot of the motivation seems to come from this idea not just that 2008 contradicts things, it's that it needlessly runs afoul of the multimedia project, which, in the context of this complaint, tends to get represented as this perfect example of watertight continuity between different bits of media. It's
See, so much I stay away from the Clone Wars era when I'm talking about how well the EU works together, because it's the most messy, because of TCW. But when the multimedia project was going on, that was working together fit really well.
certainly true that this kind of cross-medium project was really impressive and not something you'd seen a lot of up to this point, except in, say, Shadows of the Empire, but on a smaller scale, where having characters introduced and showing up between not just different books, but also different comics, games, and even a TV show, characters going between mediums, this is just something you didn't see a lot of in this phase of Star Wars. Kyle Katarn was the biggest Star Wars game character, but it took a long time for him to show up in novels which weren't just direct tie-ins to his own games. But at the same time, the cohesiveness between things, even directly just within the multimedia project, let alone with the other Clone Wars projects that came later, does tend to get significantly overstated. Let's take Anakin getting knighted, for example. There's a fan page dedicated to maintaining different timelines in Star Wars. I'll link to it in the description, but this includes the pre-TCW 2008 Clone Wars timeline, which does a really...
Okay. What time... Oh. Joe Bongiorno's timeline. Oh, that's so... Oh, I forgot how bad this is to read on this background. Wow. Anyway, yeah, okay, that's the Joe Bongiorno timeline. Original Clone Wars timeline.
Impressive job collating everything from the MMP, but it points to the fact that Anakin is a knight at the start of Season 1 of the Clone Wars 2008, only a few months into the war, as essentially the crux of why the timeline is now broken by that show, arguing that too many stories were predicated on him being Obi-Wan's Padawan too late into the war. But Anakin's knighthood wasn't necessarily even the cleanest bit of continuity within the multimedia project. We have two bits of media to look at here, the 2003 show and one of the novels of the MMP called Jedi Trial. Jedi Trial was originally set significantly later into the war, in its final year, and the book is about Anakin being sent on a mission with Neja Halcyon, funnily enough the grandfather of the aforementioned Corran Horn, as his trial to become a Jedi Knight.
Gotta go back.
It's his success here that prompts Mace Windu and Yoda to grant Anakin a knighthood. In the original animated series, however, Anakin's knighthood is treated very differently. Chapter 21 of the Clone Wars starts with the resolution of the Battle of Hypori, which began in Chapter 20. That episode had introduced General Grievous, showing him winning a really cool duel against a bunch of Jedi, including Ki-Adi-Mundi and Kukruk, who became a major player in the comics later on. That battle took place 4 months after Geonosis, per the timeline. The next scene shows the Jedi Council discussing the need for more knights, with Ki-Adi-Mundi emphasizing how the reveal of Grievous has really changed the shape of the war. This is why they want more knights. Obi-Wan, in response, suggests Anakin be knighted, specifically foregoing the trials because of everything Anakin had demonstrated in the war so far. Some members of the council, like Oppo Rancisis, are outraged at the possibility of foregoing the trials. Obi-Wan then references Anakin passing a trial of skill by defeating Ventress on Yavin 4, referencing her as that dark assassin, despite him calling her by her name and knowing her pretty well in other material set later in the war within the MMP, a trial of the flesh getting his arm chopped off by Dooku, and then every test of courage the war had dealt him. But nowhere in this do they reference that time he went off with Neja Halcyon in a book that was called Jedi Trial and was supposed to be his trial. But this...
Okay. Let me double check. Microseries is 2003. Jedi Trial was released 2004. So when the micro series is being written, Jedi Trial was not being incorporated into the writing of the show, and Genndy Tartakovsky does a minimalist dialogue style where that would be the most expedient way to do it. So I guess there wasn't communication there, but also you could say that the micro series is an interpretation of things that happen, and some details might be off as well, like the Marvel comics I tend to treat as, which you go, well, there was released at a certain period of time before they decided how Star Wars looks and how it would change direction with Dark Horse comics.
Puts Anakin's knighthood about 4 months into the war in that show. Notably, Anakin still has his episode 2 hairstyle, as does Obi-Wan. This was very clearly meant by the showrunners to be set very soon after that duel with Grievous. And if you remove it from that context, parts of the scene just don't make sense anymore. Like I mentioned earlier on in the video, the first 21 chapters of the show cover the first few months of the war, then there's a significant time gap, and the final 4 chapters, 22 through 25, cover the weeks leading up, or even just the week leading up to Revenge of the Sith. So Leland Chee did what I think is a perfectly appropriate retcon for the moment, saying that actually the time jump which occurs between chapters 21 and 22 happens between the Battle of Hypori and the council meeting, and that Anakin's hair was just in a top knot. But while this should be enough for everyone to go about their day and move on, it's still pretty clear what the intent of this scene was, and it shows that even if the multimedia project was a level of coordination not usually seen between different types of media, that was more about having crossover characters like Ventress and telling the overall story of the war, but not really in a way where each medium cared all that much about the specific plot points going on in the other ones. The show was telling a very different story from what Jedi Trial did. So in some ways, especially on the basis of Anakin's knighthood, this actually makes the 2003 show and the 2008 show fit together better than the 2003 show with the rest of the MMP, at least pre-Leland's retcon. And don't get me wrong, I have no problem with the retcon that Leland made, or retcons in general. Like I've alluded to throughout the video.
No, hang on. Funny, throaty bit. Between novels and a TV micro series, people would not always communicate exactly what their ideas were and what they were going to do to incorporate all that together as well. And so there is a part of that where it goes, if they tried to adhere way too closely to it, then they would never be able to have the creativity and freedom with their ideas to do what they want with it.
Retcons are kind of what makes the expanded universe go round, in my opinion. But it does set up the funny idea that Coyote has been complaining about Hypori for almost 3 years, with nobody else worrying about Grievous for the entire war. And if it weren't for the retcons, Kruk would have stayed dead when Grievous fought him at Hypori, rather than turning out to be alive and granting us the opportunity to see his sweet hat throughout the rest of Star Wars Legends. But now taking a look specifically at those final 4 chapters,
he's going to mention about the people present when the Chancellor was captured versus the micro series.
Some additional issues between the 2003 show and other Legends novels, specifically Labyrinth of Evil. Labyrinth isn't technically legally part of the MMP, but it is one of the pre-existing Legends Clone Wars novels, and it also tells the story of the lead-up to Revenge of the Sith, including the kidnapping of Palpatine and the opening of the Battle of Coruscant, something that the 2003 show covers as well. But both of these actually have some fairly significant differences in what different characters are up to during this time period. Part of this, I believe, is because those final 4 chapters were based on earlier drafts of Labyrinth of Evil.
Yeah, that'd be it.
But again, the core point here is that it's not like all of this was perfectly mapped out before, and the 2008 show is just the first introduction of contradictions to the Clone Wars timeline. Some of them much bigger, but also some of them much smaller. And none of this, to be even more clear, is to say that the original show or the MMP are bad, or that they should disqualify either the 2003 show or other MMP books from being considered legends despite these contradictions. I'm honestly not really a fan of most of the 2008 show or movie for a variety of reasons I won't go into here, although parts of it have grown on me over time, and I do love Rebels and The Bad Batch. Well, on the other hand, I grew up loving the 2003 show. But none of that changes the fact that the expanded universe continued on after
So he's using the micro series as the same sort of thing as TCW's, why you shouldn't remove it.
2008, and many things did in
discount
fact
it.
take into account things which had happened in the 2008 cartoon. So the people making what would become known as Legends very clearly thought of it as something they needed to consider, if nothing else. And it's hard to point to any useful...
Because everything Star Wars that came out was incorporated into the expanded universe at the time. That's the way they worked.
Definition of what is and isn't canon beyond that. When you start talking about which whole works ought to be included or excluded just because of specific contradictions, especially when they're taken into account by other sources, you're getting into an ever-shifting personal goalpost of just how contradictory things have to be before you get to that line. And I think no matter where you draw that line, there's more that gets caught up in it than just the Clone Wars 2008 show. Saying that it's the only blight of continuity errors infringing upon an otherwise carefully curated and consistent continuity is really just not an accurate representation of what Legends ever was, even just within the Clone Wars. And really, if you think this is messy, let's not even start to think about what a potential sequel trilogy by George Lucas with Darth Maul and Darth Talon would have looked like for the Legends.
Second-hand information, but we can't verify, and treatments were not that way. Do I still have the... I need... Yeah, source images from material. I don't have the screenshot. Do I? That's something else. That's Yariel Poof. There is a part in one of the adventure journals I have that explains how treatments work, right? With the early story ideas, like George Lucas gave them their story treatments. Basically, they were a collection of ideas that was a basic plot line, there's concepts that they might use for the story. And then they can be approved or rejected, and then that wouldn't even be a first draft of the story and how it would work. So many things could change in the writing process anyway, and I don't know why people give merit to what they've said or included in those treatments.
Timeline. That's going to do it for today, though. Thank you for watching. If there's something else you'd like to see covered on the channel in the future, let me know in the comments. Special thanks to the patrons and channel members whose support makes this channel possible, as well as to Marmar for editing this.
Okay, so I think what a lot of the time the micro series gets a pass for is its rule of cool and how short of sections they were. They were just snapshots of parts of the Clone Wars. And it was more rule of cool than all we have to fit exact details. And personally, when I'm reading something, unless it's the original trilogy novelizations, a lot of the time the novels can, because the original trilogy novels are based on earlier scripts and don't fit as good as later, like the prequel novels in that. I take novel details over a TV show any day of the week, even I'll take them over the movies. Personally. Because they can allow much more direct transfer of detail and information, and then you imagine it how you would imagine it based on the descriptions, which can differ between person to person, and so a lot of the time when you get a movie version of it, it's that person's depiction of said thing, which of course is George Lucas's vision for what came out, but when it becomes a larger universe, it becomes not just his story, but also everyone's story. A lot of these feel minor compared to the massive list that the Clone Wars 2008 introduced. I think I just got to Bloomin' Season 2 in my rewatch. And how many words would I have now? Let's see. I'm going to open the tab on my other thing. My rewatch notes. Do we have a word count? How do we have a word count on... Hang on. Tools word count. Nearly 5,000 words of notes, including the titling in that. A bunch of are nitpicks. Some of it are just notes of like, okay, I'm never going to watch this again, so these are so I remember things. But I'm not even in season 2 properly yet. Yeah, season 2 episode 1 is the next one. I'm getting there. There's dumb writing things that I dismiss, because you can say that for anything. But then also depictions of certain species are completely wrong, because previously they've been shown to be very different. That was something that surprised me. Like, rewatching this, I'd watched it once before, and I was like, yeah, I didn't like it that much, and there were obvious things. Rewatching it with a mind towards going, okay, what actually doesn't fit? Oh boy. Now, so his end point, right, is that it is what it is, and you just take it how it is. And enjoy the story. So it doesn't really say whether he would want it to be part of the expanded universe or not. But he is correct about saying it would be ever-moving goalposts about what you include and what you don't. And I think the biggest one, even if it's like, okay, you include the novels that are Darth Plagueis and EU-based, would be the amount of novels that are TCW tie-ins that would still technically be considered expanded universe only, because they were released during the time of the expanded universe but then are not new canon, because they don't count towards it, because especially like the movie novelization, stuff like that, does not count towards new canon, and so it has to be. Yeah, there's another picture I took of them before. And so yeah, this is out of whack from how I would order them now. But you do have the novels kind of sitting where they need to go, and all of that. And you have the TCW tie-in novels that are like, well, if they were officially published works like that, you're not going to have novels that sit in a just completely not canon to either timeline limbo.